Damn you, Shaq Fu. Damn you. Ah! Actually, I feel like a winner. Shack Burger? What the hell is a Shack Burger? Welcome to 2-Bit Gaming. Today's topic, the only handheld to seriously take on the Game Boy. This is the second in a series of alternatives to the Game Boy. Nintendo has always, and to this day continues to dominate the handheld market. This is the story of the only system to seriously challenge any Game Boy. The Sega Game Gear. Released in 1991, just 2 years after the original Game Boy, this is the third handheld to feature a color screen. While Nintendo was committed to the proven and efficient monochrome display, NEC, Atari, and Sega risked everything on beautiful color. Unfortunately, the Atari Lynx lacked quality games, and the Turbo Express cost as much as a home console, because, well, for all intents and purposes, it was. Here they are, Magic Knight Ray Earth. It was one of, if not the last, games released for the Sega Saturn. I'm a big fan of working design, so it remains one of my favorite Saturn games. Anyway, at the time I was starting to get into import gaming, and I discovered 2 Ray Earth games for the Game Gear that never made it outside of Japan. Since there's no region lockout, I bought them. They appeared to be some kind of RPG, and since I couldn't read a word of Japanese to save my life, I played approximately 5 or 10 confused minutes, put them back in their boxes, and set them on a shelf as a reminder to always look before I leap, or at least spend. I've since heard they suck, so I like to think my lack of language skills saved me some pain. I wish it could have saved me some money, but what are you gonna do? You can't tell from looking at it, but inside it's sort of an upgraded Sega Master System. Unlike the Turbo Express's state-of-the-art and expensive hardware, Sega could offer their older 8-bit technology miniaturized at a reasonable retail price. In fact, it's backwards compatible with the Master System's games, with the use of a pass-through adapter. It's pretty useless since the Game Gear's library is so much larger than the Master System, at least in the United States. I'd rather be able to play Game Gear games on the Master System, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. As you can see here, it's really not all that much larger than an original Game Boy. It does weigh a little bit more, but not that much. It takes 6 batteries compared to the 4 needed for the Game Boy. It needs the extra batteries to run the backlit screen. I think it's much more comfortable to play thanks to its controller-like shape. There's a dial for volume and a dial for contrast. If the oldest handheld you've played is the Game Boy Advance, you might not know this, but LCD technology has come a long way since 1991. Getting just the right angle, contrast, and external light level was an art form. Those of us who grew up on the Game Boy and the Game Gear became experts at maximizing viewability. While the screen is bright and colorful, it suffers from the same motion blur effect as the Game Boy. Faster scrolling games compound this, and due to the color graphics, I think the ghosting is worse than on Game Boy. It doesn't ruin the experience, and back in the day, it was just accepted as the way that LCD screens worked. The Game Gear was never able to topple the Game Boy, and for good reason. It cost more and was a freaking battery vampire. So what if the games looked and played great? If you were spending all your allowance on batteries, you can't buy new games. Wikipedia claims it would last anywhere from 5 to 6 hours, compared to the Game Boy's 10 to 14. But I remember it seeming quite a bit worse than that. It could have been the generic batteries I used to buy at Payless, not the shoe store. Like most, I'd resort to using an AC adapter. Sure, it lets you play as long as you want, but only about 6 feet from the wall. The whole point of a handheld is to take it with you and play anywhere. I mean, if you're going to play at home, you might as well play on a Genesis. Today, however, if you're looking to collect, it's not an issue since I doubt you're going to be taking it on a road trip. Just think of it as a personal game machine instead of a handheld. There are a couple common hardware problems with the Game Gear. Back in the 80s, there was a bad batch of capacitors used throughout the entire electronics industry. The audio can die, as well as the video, but both can be fixed by replacing the bad capacitors. It's relatively easy and cheap. Before I get to the games, I just want to mention that you could buy a TV tuner for this thing. I never owned one, and now that digital TV is the new standard, I doubt there's anywhere in the United States that the thing will ever work again. I might pick one up now that they're worthless, just to add to the collection. Should be cheap, and maybe I can figure out a way to mod it with a digital adapter. If I ever do, I'll make a tutorial. even though it's completely pointless. Alright, on to the games. I'm just going to stick to Sonic games since I think they're a good benchmark for the system. The Game Gear had games in every genre, so don't think all it had to offer was Sonic. Sonic the Hedgehog. This is a port of the Master System game, which was developed completely separately from the Genesis original. It's actually a very cool game, and it's hard to believe it isn't a precursor to the Genesis game. Although developed separately, it is visually and structurally to Super Mario Bros. As Sonic on the Genesis is to Super Mario World, except they came out in reverse order. Regardless, it's a fun game and available on the Wii Virtual Console. Sonic the Hedgehog 2. This is not a port of the Genesis Sonic 2. It plays just like the previous Game Gear one, but better, and it even looks and sounds a bit nicer too. Definitely worth checking out since you can usually find it for less than $1. I prefer the Master System version, which is on the Virtual Console, but if you're looking for a fun game for your Game Gear, this one is a classic. Sonic Chaos. Another port, but more like the Genesis games than the previous Master System ones. The graphics actually look good enough to almost pass for 16-bit. Sonic can now spin dash, and he has a new ability that lets him power up a faster running move. This is my personal favorite Sonic game on both Master System and Game Gear. Sonic Triple Trouble. This one's exclusive to the Game Gear, and like Chaos, it looks and plays great. It has its share of slowdown and flicker, but it never ruins the game once you're used to it. The colorful graphics blow everything on the Game Boy away, and it really feels like a miniaturized Genesis game rather than a cheap 8-bit clone. That's it for the classics. There were other Sonic games like the decent Tails Adventure, the mediocre Sonic Drift, and the abysmal Sonic Labyrinth and Sonic Blast. Don't bother with those unless you're a hardcore Sonic fan or a hardcore collector. Yeah, you'd have to be both to find any worth in Sonic Labyrinth. Even though the Game Gear's library is smaller than the Game Boy's, Sega went out of their way to ensure nearly all of the best games got mini versions on their handheld. There are plenty of classics worth owning the system for if you're into retro gaming, and the system has a retro charm you don't have to be a Sega fan to appreciate. Now it's time for Kane's 2 Bits! 1. When you factor in the poor battery life, added to being just enough larger than the Game Boy to not fit in a standard adult pocket, you have a system that comes up short next to the technically inferior, but proven technology of the Game Boy. The color screen was ahead of its time, and in this case, it means Sega should have waited, like Nintendo did. 2. The games are still fun. It's sad that Sega lost its taste for portable gaming after the Game Gear. Sega was always innovative, and a hit handheld could have sustained them alongside the Saturn, and maybe, just maybe, saved them paired with the Dreamcast. Just thinking about it almost makes me cry. Almost. That's my 2 bits. If you have any thoughts or fond memories of the Game Gear, please leave a comment or video response. As always, I'm your humble 2-bit gamer. Thanks for watching. Oh, and by the way, if you like Halo and ever wondered what it might look like on a Game Gear, check out my homebrew game, Halo Gallant Girl, or the monochrome Game Boy version, Gallant Belle. Both have been updated to maximize compatibility, and I added new features like hidden skulls, a scoring system, difficulty settings, hidden level codes, and a bonus level. If you like old school games, I think you might find it amusing. Download link in the description.